Welcome to Upthinking Finance, a podcast that offers a unique and discerning view of economics and financial planning. Here is your host, Emerson Fersch.
Welcome to another episode of Upthinking Finance. Henry David Thoreau once said, "The question is not what you look at, but what you see." My last number of episodes have been focused on geopolitics and economics, and those are certainly important topics that affect everybody. But that's really the whole point is that it affects everybody, and people are just trying to find ways to pay their rent or their mortgage. They're trying to find ways to put their kids through school, and a lot of people are just trying to find ways to be able to put food on their table. And so I wanted to bring back a return guest. His name is Charles Hugh Smith. Charles is a guy who really gets down to the socioeconomic issues and how all these macro issues really affect the world we live in, and the fact that, the path we're on isn't sustainable. Charles has been writing about social, economic, and technology trends since 2005. He has a blog called Of Two Minds. His work can also be found on his pages on Patreon and Substack, and I've also noticed his essays on a number of different financial blogs from time to time. Charles has written 16 different books. Most recent one was published in 2022, Self-reliance in the 21st Century. And anybody who's listening overseas and may not be familiar with Charles, he's a really good guy to add to your, input, your data input, or who people you read, because he brings it all down to really the practical and more of a lifestyle of view that I think it's sometimes lost in a lot of these higher level discussions. So it's my pleasure to welcome back, coming to us from the big island of Hawaii, my friend, Charles Hugh Smith. Charles, aloha. Welcome back to Upthinking Finance.
Thank you so much, Emerson. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
No, it's perfect timing. In your writing, as we were just chatting a minute ago, always really hits the mark because, we can talk finances, we can talk geopolitics and all these things that are going on all over the world. But at the end of the day, it's just people trying to survive. And so you recently wrote, I thought, an interesting article about sort of the solution to a financial system, and that, we feel like, and I think we all agree, clients I talk to as well as I'm sure, people that you interact with and yourself, that we're getting to a bit of a tipping point, and there's always kind of this debate of, well, it's the gold standard. We need to go back to the sound money system versus the fiat currency. And you kind of come from a different place with that. So maybe, if you don't mind, just kind of explaining what those two are and why you don't believe either of those is sustainable. That would be a good place, I think, to jump off of.
Okay. Yeah. And I don't claim to be an expert in currencies, but I would say I'm an interested observer. So what I notice is people want to go back to a gold standard or equivalent, perhaps a basket of currency, of commodities or something, real world tangible assets as the backing of money. And of course, this was a system that existed in the ancient world. It was the only form of money was gold and silver, right? But there was another whole system of money, which was credit based, right? When you went to the trading fair, then you would exchange bills of exchange and so on, and then you'd settle in gold. And so the idea that we can live in a world without credit is not realistic. And of course, there's various forms of credit, right? There's commercial credit that businesses use, and then there's consumer credit, right? So in the ancient world, I haven't run across any evidence that there was consumer credit, but there was a lot of commercial credit because somebody would have to front the money for the voyage to India to collect the trade, and so on and so forth. So the fiat currencies, to my mind, we can call them evil, and they're going to go to zero, and make a lot of projections about them. But why did they arise? And so the question is, why did the globalized developed economies move off the gold standard in the 20th century? And it's because there's limits, as there is in any system, right? So there's a lot of limits to that. In other words, Europe suffered when there was a shortage of silver and gold. In other words, there's not enough money to do any trading. So that's a problem, right? And so people nowadays say, well, the solution is when Bitcoin goes to $5 million each, then everyone will have 1/100 of a thousandth of it. It's like, that's not the way it works. What happens is the wealthy people end up with all the gold and silver and Bitcoin, and then trade stagnates. Okay. So how do you get around that? And then you go, well, credit is a little more actually democratic, if you will, And so the fiat currencies allowed for flexibility, right? Like the government could, if the government didn't have enough gold and silver to spend in a downturn, then you just, borrow the money into existence like we do. So the other problem with gold or precious metals or Bitcoin as a currency backing is it assumes that all trade globally is going to be equal. I sell $100 billion worth of stuff to the rest of the world, and I import $100 billion. So everything settles out. But in the real world, there's some countries are going to end up with surpluses, like countries that have a lot of hydrocarbons. They're going to end up with all the gold because all of us, anybody importing these commodities, they may not be able to trade enough with the world, and so they're going to be running a trade deficit. And then if they have to settle in gold, then the gold's gone in a few years. And that is in fact what was happening with the United States. And everybody goes, "Oh, President Nixon, he blew it. It was a terrible decision to end the gold standard." And it was like he had no choice. The United States was shipping, billions of dollars worth of gold overseas because it was running a trade deficit. And you go, well, why was it running a trade deficit? And it's like, well, we wanted to support our allies. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so we needed to support Western Europe and Japan. And the way to do it was to run a trade deficit. So there's a lot of other issues in here that, we try to simplify down and go, well, if we just had, tangible real money again, all the problems would go away. And it's all like that. I'm afraid is naive. It's like there's another set of problems that arise. So you can talk about a hybrid system, or you can talk about building a global currency that's like so-called SDR, like on a basket of currencies. I don't think there's any one perfect solution. And so, if somebody comes up with a currency that's backed by commodities or gold, that's fine. Throw it out there and let people trade it. The market will set the value of that and the utility value of it. So people say, well, why do we even have to borrow money into existence? Why don't we just print it? And it's all like, well, that's how you end up with the Zimbabwe $1 billion bill, because there's no constraints on a politician, right? If they can print $1 trillion a day, they will, right? Why not? I've got a lot of constituencies here. I got to save Medicare, Social Security, tax breaks for all those rich guys that give me money. It's like so the thing with borrowing money into existence like we do, the Treasury sells a bond and somebody gives them cash and then they promise to pay interest. That sets some kind of limit on the system. And we're, of course, as we all know, we're now running into that limit. We're paying $1 trillion in interest.
Printing $1 trillion every 100 days, I guess is what it is. I've read. You brought up a really interesting point that I've never heard about sound money, which is, now that you've said it, it's like, well, yeah, duh. But which is, yeah, if you are a country that has something everybody else wants, eventually, and you're using some kind of an asset-backed security. At some point you're going to run out of the commodity. That's a great point. So, all right. Well, I was hoping we'd solve the ills of the financial system today, but I guess we'll have to wait for the next time, Charles. No, thank you for that. So, I guess the next thing I wanted to just bring up. You talk a lot about, and you're really good at this, just bringing all this stuff that's swirling around us down to, everybody's day to day. And I know you talk a lot about, I think, and I'm paraphrasing a lot of content into some shorter terms, but you're really good at explaining, kind of detaching, and reevaluating, what does a sustainable life look like, to each individual person. And so I guess the thing I was going to ask you is, you brought up, and I should have had it up and I forgot to bring it up, but you printed this chart, that was about, how we can't prevent this system from imploding. I think that's my words. But maybe can you dive into that? Just kind of explain it conceptually for people, because I think, I think most people recognize that, where we're at can't continue. It's getting to a point where the debt does matter. I had a conversation with a gentleman just yesterday I mentioned over in Scotland who manages a big global value fund. And, the debt really is something that now you can't ignore it. It's the elephant in the room that's starting to make noise. And so I guess maybe kind of walk us down that path if you can, if that's not too complicated.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating topic, Emerson. I'm glad you brought that up. Is that, of course, we're all humans, and so we're all running wetware 1.0, right? Which was developed around 300,000 to 200,000 BC as hunter-gatherers, right? And so in that's what we're optimized for. Looking at our brains, our wetware, it's clear that we're optimized for a hunter-gatherer existence, with a little bit of herding, animal husbandry and agriculture on the side, kind of. So we're not really optimized for long-term planning, because in a hunter-gatherer sort of situation, we're keying off of the realities around us, such as the weather, drought, competing groups, when some wild orchard the fruit's going to ripen, so we're going to head that way. That kind of stuff is how we're designed. So we do think and prioritize short-term thinking. And so when something starts decaying on a a macro level, we tend to view it as temporary, right? That we're going to respond to it. So say like at the start of a Great Depression, like say in 1929 or 1930, very few people were saying, wow, we got a plan for how we're going to get out of this, and it's going to take us 10 to 12 years or whatever. It's like everyone's like, oh, everything will be fine next quarter, right? Everything will bounce right back. So that's part of the problem, is short-term thinking. The other part is expediency, and we see this in our political system, and in fact, all political systems, right? So it's like, well, let's just kind of reduce the pain right now. What do we need to do to lessen the pain? And so everything becomes expedient. So those of us in the financial world, such as you and I and many of your other guests, we know that, well, the Federal Reserve did all these crazy things in 2008 and 9, and it was all expedient, right? There was no grand plan. It was like, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So let's get rid of mark to market. Valuing stuff in the market is now a problem. Well, then let's just get rid of that, and then let's just print $4 trillion. And and so and I see a lot of that as being it is, again, short-term thinking, and it's like our ideas pain avoidance, right? So and of course we see this everywhere. Like the diet, we try to stay on the diet. It just, the pain is too high, so we drop it. Our exercise program, I'm sore, I'm tired, so it's, the pain is too great. So that's part of it. And then I think we're prone to wishful thinking. And it's called magical thinking. And so we rely on technology. Like, well, somebody will invent something that'll make it all go away, right? And then we also rely on things like the Federal Reserve or central banks. Like, well, they'll come up with something, and the economy will bounce back. So all of those things work well. We have to remember, they work really well on short-term problems, right? But they don't work on long-term problems, and that's the problem. And so we fall prey to all these things, and then we can't come up with a conceptual version that matches the actual long-term problem, right? And so when we look at ancient civilizations, they were highly successful in various ways, but then they were unable to adapt to like rapidly changing circumstances that changed the fundamentals. Like, for instance, a pandemic kills 40% of your population, that kind of thing. Or, there's a drought and suddenly your water supply is depleted. It's like, how do you deal with that kind of macro problem? And so we're not really well adapted to that. So that's how collapse happens, is we are sort of OODA loop, the orient, observe, orient, decide, and act loop is real tight. It's like, what do we do today, tomorrow, and this quarter, when actually we need to say, what are we going to do? What do we start now that's going to come to fruition like a decade from now? And that's hard to do.
I watched a movie that you probably are familiar with called The Inside Job. This is back. It was a documentary about the 2008-2009 collapse, and I watched The Big Short. That was good, but this one, and all these names of these people that were involved making these major decisions. And the reason I'm bringing this up because, and I know this is going to sound bad, but these people are not bright. They're not bright, and they don't have an honest bone in their body. I mean, there's these interviewers were going up to these different people, the Federal Reserve board members that were involved, and pointing out obvious conflicts of interest, obvious just completely, unethical behavior. And they just have these blank looks on their face. Well, I didn't do anything. It's just, and they believe it. And so to your point is not only do you have this, they'll fix the problem mentality that I think we've all kind of, to some extent you just get conditioned to, believe, but then the people that they are not bright, they're not intelligent, and they're completely self-concerned with. I didn't realize, I think, and I probably should be careful what I'm saying, but I think one of these companies that got bailed out during all this or that got supported and preserved was Goldman. And so whoever was connected with that, the value of their stuff, they didn't lose anything. Somehow part of this negotiation was that the values of their stock or whatever it was protected. And it's like, my gosh, and so to me, that you look at this stuff and it's this thirst for this power that prevents this change. And now we're kind of up against the wall. And so that's a question I would ask you is, what does it look like to your best ability to kind of just speculate? What is a new economic structure or just a new, and maybe I asked you this before, I'm just asking again, but I'm saying, what does a transition look like? If this system eventually has to fold up its tent and go away because it just can't continue, where do we go? Do you have any thoughts just, in the perfect world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emerson. And if you had asked me last year, I would have come up with maybe a different answer because, we're all advancing, we're all kind of evolving our understanding. I would say, let's start with the context of growth and progress, which are the fundamentals of the modern era. Right? So where is the source of growth? Well, if we boil it down, it's credit. Nobody buys a house with cash, or very few people do. Or if they are, they're selling a house that they have paid off and then they have the cash. But ultimately, vast majority of consumption is based on credit globally. So there's credit. And so without credit, what would we have? Well, we'd have a lot less consumption, right? Because we have to borrow from future income in order to buy stuff today. The other thing is, what's the other source of our growth is, well, it's affordable energy, right? Because once energy gets too expensive, then we don't have enough money left to borrow more money and consume, right? And we don't have enough money to save or invest either. So those were the two foundations of growth and progress, say within over the last century or so, right? So if those go away or those no longer are as beneficial, then we have a problem, right? We're not going to be able to grow if there's not enough affordable energy and if there's not enough credit or if the credit's too expensive. And so that's kind of the general context of like, okay, so what's going to change? The other thing is, how do you make a profit? Now, of course, you're embedded in finance and you speak with a lot of financial experts. And we can boil away a lot of complexity. And it turns out that what's most profitable is monopoly. So you can just charge whatever you want and lower the quality. And your customer base has no alternative or so few alternatives. It's like a cartel. They're stuck with it. They have to pay more. And then you've got a guaranteed profit. And we see a lot of that in America, right? Like what are the most hated companies? Well, Xfinity, an internet TV provider. And other monopolies. Everybody hates all the monopolies with good reason, right? And so there's that, and then there's planned obsolescence. And this is one of the things that is like one advantage of being older is I remember what life was like 2 generations ago. And it was like, well, you go buy a washing machine or something at Sears, and it would last like 30 years. Now, anecdotally, all I hear is a brand new $3,000 fridge is broken in 3 years. Something fails in the electronics, the digital board, and the repair person comes and goes, it's not worth fixing. It's like, well, wait a minute. We used to buy like something that was not considered fancy. It wasn't a fancy washer or fridge. It just was a normal, regular priced device that lasted, 30 years. And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm not talking about 1923. I mean, I'm talking about 1990, And so how is it that when you think that through, and that's true of everything, right? Your iPhone, the battery starts decaying, and then it's like, oh, I got to get a new phone every 2 years, and then a new PC and a new, and so it's all like, well, wait a minute. Over the course of 20 years, if we have to buy six appliances or 10 electronic devices where we used to buy one or two, what do we call that? Well, it's obviously incredibly profitable for the people who've designed the obsolescence, but it's also a terrible inflation because we're spending huge amounts of money for the same, good or service. So I think that the system is broken on those levels. And so what's the future's like? Well, let's say credit becomes too expensive or scarce like it used to be. Well, then consumption's going to go down. So then maybe we shouldn't measure growth as the one thing that matters. Maybe we should look at human well-being, for example. And I'm not the first to say this. Many people say this. Joseph Stiglitz, the famous economist, says we should throw away GDP, which is worthless, and we should have an index of human well-being. And that should be our focus. Never mind whether the economy grows, stays the same, or diminishes somehow. It's like, who cares, And so that, I think, is a positive future. And then also getting rid of planned obsolescence. Make it impossible for someone to make a profit by making a good or issuing a service which is defective, basically designed to fail, or uses components of which there's so little quality control that it's like planning obsolescence because you're using garbage components. I mean, you can say, oh no, we didn't plan that. But if you're using rubbish components, then the thing's going to die in a short period of time from that alone, So we need to make things durable again. And that would be get rid of a huge source of inflation. And it would also boost the purchasing power of people's money and investments. Because, if the thing lasts 20 years instead of 2 years, that's obviously good for the planet too, because very little is recycled. As you know, it's like 3% of all the plastics recycled. So don't tell me, oh no, it's all fine because we're recycling. No, worthless. Lithium-ion batteries, 2%. There's nothing. Recycling is a joke. I mean, it's a nice idea, but in the practical world, no.
You remind me, every time we've gotten a new mattress, I always think, where do those things go? I mean, how do you get rid of a mattress? Right? I mean, anyway, you just reminded me of something, a quote, a Bobby Kennedy quote, RFK, and he, on gross, domestic product. He made this speech. This was the University of Kansas back in the 60s. He made this comment. He says, yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, of the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. And, for a guy who's been labeled, he spoke a lot of truth back at a time when a lot of this stuff was shifting. And that's what because my question was going to be, I mean, how do you measure the well-being of people? And, I guess that's one way. And I want to get to that, back to that, but I wanted to ask you, because the thought that pops in my mind is, okay, you get rid of, this, because obviously there's people being employed to keep building the new microwave that's going to break every 3 years. What happens, so one hand, like you said, you've got more money to spend on other stuff. But what happens to those jobs? I mean, there's got to be a shift then in terms of, if you don't need as many people at the factory building appliances, what do they do?
Precisely. Then that raises the topic that a lot of people look at, and they come to the conclusion it's universal basic income. We should just give everybody a living wage, whether they're working or not. So then therefore, the idea that if you can't find a job that you're going to be impoverished would go away. But then there's a lot of concern about that idea of what's the incentive in the system. And if we're looking at well-being, I think we have to start with a couple of basics. One is that humans want to be useful. We don't want to sit around watching TV all day. That makes us feel worthless. And that's why we have such high rates of depression and anxiety. and addiction in the U.S. is there's a lot of ways to feel worthless. And so we obviously need an economy that makes use of people and gives them opportunities to be productive and useful. Now, whether that's going to be hugely profitable or not is the problem. And the thing is with capitalism, in however you want to describe it, the primary motivation is and the driver of increasing productivity is like, how can we make more money? Using fewer inputs, less labor, less stuff, and then generate a product that generates more profit. And so that's wildly successful in certain ways, but it also is not wildly successful once you get cartels and monopolies and institutions. For example, what about higher education? How come there's no competition that leads to a 4-year degree that costs $1,000? It's all like, no, there's too many vested interests in this whole system, and the same with healthcare in America. How come we spend more than any other country, and yet so many people are ill, not getting medical care, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it's because profit by itself is not enough. You have to have a social set of incentives as well. And so you can say, well, what if we're going to allow the sectors that are productive to go ahead and pursue profit? That's fine. We're not trying to get rid of that incentive, but what we have to add some other input here where the incentives are, we can put people to work, and the work is not necessarily aimed at being profitable, but it's like useful. It's providing some valuable human service, and maybe they're not going to make, they're not going to be millionaires, but they're going to be valued. And as a result, they'll have a livelihood, and they'll be able to feel, hey, I'm contributing to society. I'm not worthless, And so I think that's really important. So how do you design that? It's like, well, there's a lot of different ways. And one we can sort of say, in general, relocalize the economy. In other words, like if I go out in my backyard and I grow some tomatoes, say, and I think I'm going to take those to the farmer's market and try to make money off of my extra 100 pounds or whatever. Well, who am I competing with? I'm competing with people growing stuff in South America and air freighted in, 5,000 miles or whatever. And if they can beat me by a dime, I've got no market. And it's all like, well, wait a minute, is this really a rational system? We're burning jet fuel to save like a dime on a tomato that we could grow here. And so there's a lot of irrationality when you say the only metric we're going to use is profitability. Right. And so if you relocalize your economy, it allows for a lot more jobs because people are then paid to do stuff in your own community that was offloaded to some global place. And so a lot of economists freak out at this because they think that the sole source of our prosperity is that we offload everything overseas. In other words, this is why we're rich, is because we let other people make money doing all this stuff and building all this stuff and answering all of our phone calls in Egypt and the Philippines. And it's all like, yeah, but then we've hollowed out our economy. So is that really beneficial? And then you have to ask, how come we got so unequal in wealth? And so it turns out that globalization and financialization, the use of credit and leverage, well, they benefit the top 5%. And then that's what all the evidence shows. And so then you can say, well, and then maybe if we reverse those or limit globalization and financialization, then sort of naturally the economy would start, there'd be more opportunity for people in the bottom 90%.
Alex Craner, we talked about this. I asked him a similar question, and he did bring up he didn't call it universal income, but he did kind of call it sort of a base. And my thought was, everybody, I believe this, and I imagine you do too, that, everybody comes to this earth with some kind of a talent and a gift. And, I stumbled into the financial industry. I mean, it wasn't like I grew up thinking I want to be in finance or economic. I mean, it just, a series of events led me here. And that just happens to be an industry in this particular structure where you can do pretty well and make a good living and, enjoy some things. But what about the poet? What about the writer? What about those the artists? Unless you get hit big and go commercial, I imagine there's a bit of a selling of your soul to get there anyway. you know. And so it's almost like there needs to be a shift of where value is put. I mean, it's, you know, because those things are important, you know, and just because a person is artistically inclined, does that mean they should be poverty ridden? Because I mean, most people that have that kind of a gift, you know, especially a young person, you know, how are they going to pay the rent writing, you know, short stories or essays? I mean, you know, I'm saying, it just, and so I see your point. And you brought up, I was going to mention, you brought up depression and there's a, you know, the younger generations, I think, is where you start to see some hopelessness. I mean, do you observe that?
Yeah, and I want to mention real quick, Emerson, you mentioned before we started recording that you had a story that you wanted to share, and I want to make sure we have time for that. But yeah, I've been writing more about that because as an older person that started my work career like 50 some years ago, it's obvious to me that people young, you know, millennials and Gen Z they're facing a much more difficult environment than we were. In other words, their wages just don't have the same purchasing power. And so, and because of the financialization, if you will, which emphasizes the wealth effect, you know, in other words, like, well, we're going to grow the economy by making people feel richer, and then they'll borrow and spend more money. And so that's been a big part of the Federal Reserve and other central banks, but that just concentrates wealth into the top 5 or 10%, right? Or the top, you know, 2%. And so what that does is it creates an asset bubble, right? Basically, the credit and asset bubbles then raise the price of everything. And so if you just are a wage earner and you don't have investment income and you don't have a really high income, then, you know, you can't afford a house. And I want to mention this is global. Like, if you are a Chinese worker and you are like a, say, normal working class person, maybe you're making $6,000 a year, and you know, US, and then the condominium is $300,000. I mean, and it's the same here. I mean, if you're making like $30,000 a year, and the basic house is $300,000, you're out. There's no way you're ever going to own anything unless you get real creative. Like, for instance, you go to a rural area and you buy a piece of land and then you build a mini house, you know, but you have to have the skills yourself or you have to trade for it. And so it's that the conventional life is no longer affordable. And so you read a lot of comments about this, right, online and in social media. It's all like, you know, I'm working as hard as I can and I'm living in my car on the church parking lot. You know, and so it's like, well, I don't have any solution to that. You know, in other words, like, the problem is higher up the chain. You have to destroy the credit asset bubbles. And that means destroying the wealth effect. In other words, things have to be dropped way back down to where they were priced, say, 30 years ago. And then that, of course, will devastate everybody that thought that what I consider phantom capital was real. Because, you know, I mean, I was in the Bay Area for, 30 years. A house that my friends would buy for $145,000 is now worth, $1.2 million. Well, now tell me that's not phantom capital. I mean, did everybody's wage go up tenfold? So we have to deal with these problems at a macro level if we're going to save the future of the economy for future generations. And that means deflating, asset bubbles, and it means backing off of globalization. And for instance, those two things, and then relocalizing the economy, whether it's more efficient, it's measured in profit or not. And they said that's my diagnosis. That's not going to be very popular.
No, it isn't. That's why you're not a politician, Charles. Ultimately, what you're saying is, in a nice way, is there's got to be some pain, and people that have, and I'm not judging it because I guess I fall in that category too. You work hard, you accumulate some stuff, you feel like you've earned your place. But what you're talking about is going to require some pain, which is exactly what's been avoided, the whole time is no one wants to necessarily sacrifice. But the interesting trade-off of that is, you were talking about health, and I was thinking about the Ozempic thing. I think of this new thing about lose weight by taking a diabetes drug. I mean, and I, as a person that's been in, 12-step AA for, I'll be 36 years sober in a couple of weeks. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is there's been this thing about pills. You can take a pill to get rid of your alcoholism and your addiction. And I'm thinking, it's like going to the gym and getting in shape. That the process is what it's about. It's not about the result. It's the whole journey, showing up at the gym when you don't want to because you're just tired. Same thing with, the spiritual journey that comes from a recovery program. I mean, that's the whole point of it. And so on one hand, you're right, there's pain, but on the other hand, that's really where the growth is going to come from. And maybe that's the springboard to a community and a view where the poet does have value. Maybe that's what it takes for people to reassess and shift. And I'm not trying to make it sound easy, but the point you mentioned a story. We had a girl that works in town at a coffee shop, and she was upset one morning and, kind of told us she had some kind of a dental problem that she couldn't afford. And, she's battling for hours with other young people in the community we live in. It's, I think, the highest poverty rate in Utah here. And it's intergenerational. So people have a hard time, getting out of it. And we offered to help her. It just felt like the right thing to do. And the only reason I bring it up is not because we're like great people. I mean, you help people when you feel compelled to, but was her response. She literally broke down. Sorry, it just started sobbing. It was such a relief. It was like, and I mean, for something that shouldn't be, because she couldn't afford insurance, right? And it's something that shouldn't be that big a burden. And then you realize this is just one young person that's, out of many that are just struggling. And it struck me, it's like, gosh, yeah, what are these younger people? How do they ever get a foot up? When you're on that thin of a razor blade, where if the wind shifts like that for something where most people could write a check or I guess would have some kind of insurance, at least you think, you know what I mean? It's heartbreaking. And you realize, yeah, I mean, it's just not right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so let's talk about that. And I'm glad you told the story, Emerson, because it really encapsulates what's wrong with the American economy and society. I mean, it really does. In other words, is that kind of inequality of basics, is that really serving us well? To have people who are fantastically wealthy and then people who, can't afford to get their dental problem fixed, even though they're working. And so, and of course, everybody wants, as you say, a pain-free solution, which is, let's just print another trillion and give it away. That's how we do it. And it's all like, well, no, what if we don't borrow another trillion? What if we have to actually sacrifice? What if we have to say, those of us who make an upper middle class lifestyle, that we are going to pay more, and we're not going to whine about it and say that it's not fair. It's just like, let's try to make it across the board. Let's make it as fair as we can. But, or we demand some other system. And I'm not, my approach is the market is a good idea. And so you let people choose, right? But what the problem with our system is that we don't really have much choice. That's the problem. In other words, you're in a zone with Xfinity as the provider. And then, well, maybe you can use Musk's satellite thing or whatever, but it's sort of like you're stuck, right? You're stuck. And so there's so many things like that. Like, well, I want to buy, here's a kind of a dumb example, but, well, I want to buy some healthy bread or whatever. And it's all like, well, guess what? There really isn't any. And then the answer is, well, there's no market for that. It's all like, well, how do you guys know? We're not even given the option. I want a cheap, reliable car. Well, we don't have any of those. We have expensive cars that are sort of reliable. And so I think the same is true of healthcare. For example, I've often thought a lot of people complain about the VA, the Veterans Administration system, And those are legitimate complaints. I mean, look at the size of the population that the VA serves. How many veterans are there in the United States? Tens of millions. And so you go, okay, there's problems with that system. But on the other hand, it's owned lock, stock, and barrel by the federal government. And there's a political oversight process in there. In other words, you don't have and if I'm just saying, it's like if we had some kind of basic dental plan that was national, for example, there's going to be limits on it. It's not going to be open-ended. You only get X amount of coverage, but and there's not going to be every dentist is going to get involved because the payments are going to be restricted, just like Medicare, right? But it would be a way of giving a choice. In other words, if you don't want to get involved in that, well, then you don't have to, right? But your tax dollars are going to go to that because otherwise there's no way to take care of people without dental insurance. And a lot of the dental insurance is, to me, that's like fake insurance, In other words, you don't really get anything out of it, And so that's another. So anyways, I don't think there's any pain-free solution. And I think that's your point. And I think that's an excellent point. There's going to have to be sacrifices made. And we've created sort of a fantasy that we should have a wonderful life with no sacrifice. And as you say about the gym or your diet or fitness, that's not the way it works. And I think you're totally right. Facing up to the pain and the sacrifices is our way of changing, because at least in my life and my observations, humans don't change unless there's no other choice.
There's a line in a song by Tears for Fears: nothing ever changes unless there's some pain. And
I think it's true.
Yeah. You mentioned the markets, and I thought that was a really good point, because there's a book, and I've mentioned it before with another guest, but it's called The Myth of Capitalism, and it's by this guy, Jonathan Tepper. And he actually, what he talks about, I never pronounce this right, but it's oligopolies, where these big, like you mentioned, insurance, why is it that when you live in a certain area, you only have certain choices, or even cable TV, you brought that up.
Yeah.
These big companies choose to coexist to control their market share and don't compete with each other. And so you have, it's like the banking system. I mean, so no, I agree. I mean, we eliminate all these ideas, and I guess it's just a hope that people, are at least aware when the time comes. But the last thing, the conversation with you goes by so quickly. You talked about localization, and this is something that my wife talks about a lot, because at the end of the day, there's a faction of the population that's hanging their hat on the result of this upcoming election in the U.S. that somehow, depending upon which way it goes, it's going to, restore, sanity to, and somehow, there's a savior element to it that bothers me, because at the end of the day, one person is one person, and whether they're a part of the system or not, or wherever they come from, the change comes locally. I think it's exactly what you said, and whether you're supporting local farms like where we live. I was worried when we left California that, our ability to eat healthy was going to be compromised moving here, and we're actually way better off. I mean, you've got local farms, you've got farmers markets, fresh produce, fresh, ranches that have been around for 100+ years. I mean, it's actually been great. We have a friend who we buy fresh eggs from her chickens every, Friday. We're getting a couple dozen eggs. And so to me, and then, and of course, then there's the getting involved with the politics, but that's, I think, really where the change is going to happen. It's not going to be up here. I think it is kind of a bottom up, again, that's just my observation, but I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Because that seems to kind of make sense, I think.
Yeah, well, I use the term which actually you are named for, Emerson, the eminent American philosopher, Emerson, who wrote a book, or actually more like a long essay, called Self-reliance. And, I wrote a book about that called Self-reliance in the 21st Century. And I think that's kind of one element that feeds directly into localism is if you say, well, I'm going to start taking care of my life and self more directly, right? In other words, what can we do in our own little world to take control of our health, our income, our investments, And then that is actually a way of saying I'm going to become more self-reliant. And it doesn't mean self-sufficient. It doesn't mean I'm going to grow all the food I eat or anything like that, but I'm going to be more aware of what I'm depending on and where it's coming from, and maybe reducing my exposure to the risks of globalization. And I'm going to start supporting people who are providing the essentials of life locally, right? And that's what you're doing when you go to the farmer's market or the local cafe instead of going to Starbucks, for example, where the money goes to owners spread around the world, all of whom, the vast majority of whom are very wealthy. So it's like we keep the money in our community by, and that all feeds into solutions, because if we're taking care of the local ranchers and farmers, then we're not going to be disrupted when that supply chain that's 5,000 miles long breaks. And that was one of the things I think that the pandemic lockdown showed us that was positive, is there was pain. And it was like, well, you know what? All these global supply chains are in fact quite long and fragile. I mean, they're intrinsically, right? Because they've been you could say they've been hyper incentivized to cut costs. And so there's now only, 3 factories in the world that make this stuff, or 2 factories, right? So when one of those links breaks, then the supply chain goes down. And so that's been a positive thing that I think you can see across the United States now. People are starting to realize there's a national security element in supply chains. And of course, we're actually fostering our own national security by fostering localism. It's not just some academic abstraction. It's like, yeah, it means if we're paying people to grow stuff here and make stuff here in the United States, then we're not exposed to the risks of supply chains breaking globally. So that's a plus both nationally and locally.
That seems to be, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but getting back to the economics, I've built out a pretty good network in Europe now just through contacts. And so it's clear that there's a move towards getting away from the centralized Eurozone currency, that whole thing, because it's compromised. Certainly it's you've taken 21 countries, I think it is, and tried to combine them into one currency where each one has different financial, it impacts everybody differently. But then you've also got the cultural history that's starting to get, people are attached to. It's who they are. And so the point is countries like France and Germany can't carry the responsibility. And so countries are starting to get, even Japan, again, without going off on tangents, there's a bit of an element that's emerging of, I guess you could call it protectionism or more of a, I just say it's every man for, every country for themselves kind of mentality that's breaking out of this. And so it kind of speaks to that, where ultimately, it starts becoming what's best, for the local will eventually, you build out and it's going to benefit everybody. So yeah, no, it's just complicated. I appreciate, you say, I appreciate independent thinkers, because, there's so much of this groupthink that goes on where that it comes from the experts with the degrees and the whatever, and yet it's all kind of the same thing. It's all just perpetuate the system mentality, and look where that's gotten us. You've got a generation of younger people, like you said, that we talked about, that just don't see a way. What's in it? What do I have to look forward to? I will say this: my son, he's 20, and granted, he's grown up in a comfortable life. We've done some traveling and some things, but what's interesting so I guess he'd be Gen Z, is he's not attached to stuff. It's almost like there isn't, I don't know why that is, but he's not attached to things the way I am, where your success, let's say, is measured by, whatever it might be, some external thing. And I mean, I'm being very honest. That's a thinking that is very difficult to get out of, just because that's, the world you grow up in. But I almost wonder if maybe that's the younger generations will lead out because of that, because there's an element of disillusionment, and perhaps just seeing people, he also doesn't have a racist bone in his body, he's not a, and so you just kind of wonder, maybe it's these up and coming generation has been born for this time, Maybe that's an element of hope, I guess.
I definitely think so. Yeah, and the leadership, in my view, can't move fast enough to the millennials and Z, and and I think that'll be positive. Absolutely, I think because they're going to bring a change of values, and maybe that as you say, every generation has the values of how they grew up, and so we grew up in a very materialistic time, and so maybe a reduction in that focus is going to be positive, and more like, what's the quality of my life as opposed to how much stuff I can show myself on social media with.
Right, right. So let me ask you this, Charles. I mean, you write about so many things and you just have a way of cutting through to really what seems to matter. That's what I appreciate as one of the few, my sort of tribe of people I read and kind of try to assimilate all these different views. You add kind of that X factor that, no one else can hit. I mean, I don't know. Is it fair to ask you? I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but it just kind of as a concluding kind of a thought. I mean, how do you see things going, good, bad, or indifferent over the next, year, or let's say through the end of the year, particularly after the election? I mean, it seems like a pivotal point in time in the U.S. as well as, in the world. I mean, I think if I read somewhere that there's more elections going on globally than there ever has been in any one year. Is that a fair question to lay in your lap?
Yeah, it is. And again, kind of going back to our thing about short term and long term, I think my sense is, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, my sense is we're in a new cycle, and there's various ways of describing it. I mean, historian Peter Turchin says that this is a 50-year cycle of disorder, right? And so whether you call it a Kondratiev cycle or a cycle of disorder or whatever you want to term it, it's clear that the systems that we rely on have become overly complicated and are failing in a lot of different ways, right? So we have to adjust, evolve, and then we just, as we discussed, we're not going to change anything until the pain is so great that we have no choice. So I think it's sort of like, I don't care who gets elected, frankly. I don't think it really matters, because I see the trend is, let's just try more expedient stuff. Let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. We're going to try to keep everything the same. We're going to try to keep the system glued together exactly as it is. And then it'll have to break in some way that there's no feedback to fix it. Then we'll have to adapt. And so if I don't know whether anything will change in a year, but I would say within the next 7 to 8 years, something will break. And it will probably be, I mean, in systems terms, it's something that would break fast enough that there's no way to respond to it and restore equilibrium. For instance, like, there'll be some break in the economy that the Fed can't fix by printing another $4 trillion.
Right.
Or that printing the $4 trillion will break the system even further, and then and wipe out any other positive feedback that might have happened. So and where it will come from, I don't have a prediction, because we live in a very complicated society and economy, and so all I know is that it's as pressures build, then stuff starts breaking down, and then we get, to your point, you mentioned a tipping point. There's lots of ways of describing this, but basically something breaks that cascades, and then the dominoes fall, and then we're facing the need for a systemic change. In other words, just kind of cosmetic stuff doesn't work anymore. So, and that's what I anticipate, but where it'll happen, I'm not even sure. It could be social. It could be that the young people say, you know what, we're just going to quit. Like in China, they call it lying flat, or let it rot. You just back out. You just go, well, I'm just going to work part-time at 7-Eleven. Forget it. I'm not going to strive. I'm not going to work like a maniac. I'm not going to try to buy a house. I give up. I'm out of it. So what happens then to the economy if people say, you've boxed me into a hopeless situation, I'm out. I'm just going to get by. Well, you're going to lose a lot of vitality and consumer growth and blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe that will be the source of the break. Or it could be, like a debt crisis, or the collapse of an asset bubble, I'm not sure where it'll come from, but I see the pressures building, and I suspect it'll come somewhere, and maybe it'll surprise all of us.
That's kind of where I go, actually, as I'm listening to you, because, I mentioned this again to Alex, my interview with Alex Craner a couple of months ago. But, you hear all this, and I know you see this too, the, black swan event. Everybody's calling for the economic. And I'm thinking, a black swan event, it's happened already. You don't anticipate it, because that's the whole definition of a black swan event, is it's a surprise. You don't predict it. And so I'm thinking maybe that's what it is. Maybe it is, like you said, something that just completely levels the playing field for people, not only maybe economically, but spiritually. And I love the way you describe that. It's just this, it can't be solved by writing a check. That makes sense to me, actually. And I think, one thing I gleaned from your writing that at least from a belief system place I've been able to get to is to allow, to be able to adapt, to not be married to thoughts. There's that thing you hear, well, the older I get, the less I know. I'm actually embracing that without fear. I put a lot of stock in institutional things, whether it's work, even religion, and you start to realize God is a lot bigger than the box. You just have to be open. And I think there's a piece that comes from not being attached to an outcome. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, Anyway, I appreciate you, Charles. I just love talking to you, and you bring such a great perspective. Any final thoughts before we sign off here? Because if not, I could keep going on for another hour.
It's been a great conversation, Emerson. And I guess I'd just say that I feel it in you and you feel it in me, is that we're actually positive. And it's not positive, we're positive about the future and growth in the sense of development, evolution. And it's not that there's going to be no pain. We're not like, I don't really see wishful thinking as a solution, or like you said, the diet pill instead of actually living healthy, because the benefit of living healthy is so much more than what you can get out of a pill. So I'm saying, okay, we're going to go through a painful period, but it's going to be net positive in so many ways, because we're not going to evolve fast enough or appropriately enough without that challenge and that pain. So I'm positive about it. And so like you, I agree with you. Flexibility is the number one asset in my view. So people say, well, what's your money going to be worth in 10 years? Or, what's this asset going to be worth? I don't know. And I don't really care. We're going to get through it, whatever.
I was thinking that too. In the end of the day, when you get right down to it, and I think this is the thing that's sad, because there is an element in the human spirit. Not just, I was thinking, okay, well, the Americans have it in their DNA to, we rise to the occasion, and, but it really is a human quality, survival. And I think that we've gotten so far away from that. Some circumstances that bring forth that kind of ingenuity and creativity, I don't know how that could be a bad thing ultimately, and I guess, simple, it's hard to be disappointed if you're not attached to expectations, right? I mean, then at least you can kind of go with the flow. Anyhow, Charles, thank you so much for your time today, and thanks for coming back on Upthinking Finance.
Thank you, Emerson. It was a great conversation.
Emerson Fersch is a registered representative with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisor services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from Capital Investment Advisors. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. The guest speakers and the companies they represent are not affiliated with or endorsed by LPL Financial or Capital Investment Advisors. Individual tax and legal matters should be discussed with your tax or legal expert. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted. and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal.